Welcome to tonight's event, Training Techniques for Our Animals, Positive or Permissive. I'm Mary Claire Speckner with the Bartholomew County Public Library, along with Stephanie Merrifield from our Digital Underground, and Stephanie is handling the technical aspects of our program. If you have questions tonight, just enter them in the comments section, and Stephanie will relay them at the end of the program. Our presenter is Dr. Melissa Shyan-Norwalt. Melissa received her MS in experimental psychology from the Illinois Institute of Technology and her PhD in comparative cognition from the University of Hawaii, where she did research with dolphins. That's pretty cool. Her postdoctoral fellowship was at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center, where she studied comparative memory and problem-solving skills in non-human primates. She is presently an educator, assistant professor in the psychology department at the University of Cincinnati. Melissa is certified by the Animal Behavior Society as a certified applied animal behaviorist. She maintains a part-time private practice consulting on companion, domestic, and exotic animal behavior and animal welfare and enrichment concerns for private individuals, laboratories, and zoos. Melissa has presented in the Red Room before, so you may have caught one of her presentations in person previous to this one tonight. And now over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Mary Claire. I'm sharing my screen, and here we go. So thank you everyone for coming, and some of you may have seen me before or heard me before at a couple of previous talks on social signals of dogs and cats. Today we want to talk about training techniques for animals, and I'm not going to teach you how to train your animals necessarily, but we're going to talk about the positive training movement and what it represents, and some practical advice on what to think about when you're deciding how to train your animal. And this holds true for a number of different animals with all the same kind of basic principles. So positive training's in vogue. If you go online and you're looking for an animal trainer, or you're looking for help, or you want to read a book, there's a lot out there going, positive training, we only use positive training techniques. And what they're usually talking about is positive reinforcement, always following a behavior with something pleasant to increase that likelihood. So if you teach your dog to sit and you give it a cookie, that dog is going to sit more, and you've used positive training techniques. Punishment is usually always talking about unpleasant consequences. You yell at a child for doing something wrong. You put your dog in its crate for doing something wrong. And these seem very straightforward, but the reality is it's a lot more complex, and the consequences are a lot more complex because we have multiple consequences going on all the time. Excuse me one moment. Nope, that'll be fine. Gwen, be quiet. Sorry, I have a dog who's whining. The behaviorist always has the worst behaved dogs. No, I'm just kidding. So let's look at the 4 types of consequences that we can have. We can have, when we're talking about types of consequences, we're talking about operant conditioning, and we're using a number of techniques and types of jargon. So when we say positive, it doesn't mean pleasant. It means we're adding something to the situation, and we can add something pleasant or we can add something unpleasant. When we're talking negative, we're talking about removing or subtracting something from the situation, and we can remove something pleasant or remove something unpleasant. So if we look at the first one, positive reinforcers, we increase a desired behavior. Anything that's a reinforcer by definition increases the desired behavior by adding a pleasant consequence afterwards. Your dog sits on command and you give it a cookie. That's likely to increase its chances of sitting on command again. Negative reinforcer, we want to increase the desired behavior by removing an unpleasant consequence. And we'll talk about an example of that in the next slide. Positive punishers are what we normally think of as punishment. You decrease an undesired behavior by adding an unpleasant consequence. Your dog chews up your shoe, you yell at it. That's supposed to, you're adding the yelling to the situation. That's supposed to decrease the chances of it chewing your shoe again. Negative punishers also decrease behavior by removing a pleasant consequence. Your teenager comes in late from curfew, you take away their car privileges so that you reduce the likelihood of them coming in late. So when we're talking positive or negative, we're not saying pleasant and unpleasant. We're using mathematical terms, adding or subtracting. So these are often in applied animal behavior jargon. These are often called the Big Four Quadrants because we have four quadrants. So positive reinforcement, an example would be, as I said before, the dog sits on command and you give it a treat. A negative reinforcer, you tell the dog sit and you push down on the dog's bottom until the dog sits and then you stop pushing. The stopping the pushing is reinforcing. Positive punisher, your cat jumps up on the table and you spray it with a water bottle. You're decreasing the likelihood of it jumping on the table by adding getting sprayed in the face with water. Negative punisher, your cat scratches you while you're trying to pet it and you stop petting. That reduces the likelihood of it scratching again because you've removed that consequence. So these are the four quadrants. Now, I like to use an analogy when we're talking about, do we want to only do positive training or should we be using punishers as well? And this is an analogy from Baumrind in 1966, where he was describing parenting styles. And keep in mind that we know that parents use lots of different parenting styles and circumstances and situations change. But if we look at these four categories and then compare them to how we're training animals, whether they're dogs, cats, horses, pigs, you name it, it makes a lot of sense about why we want to use all four quadrants in our training and not only positive training techniques. So in parenting styles, we talk about discipline level, how many rules and how strict is the parent. We also talk about nurturing level, how much caring is shown, how much loving, how much hugging. You know what nurturing means. So if we have high discipline and high nurturing, that means there are rules, but there's a lot of love shown and sometimes flexibility. When we're talking about high discipline, but not much nurturing, we're called authoritarian. There are rules, but no flexibility to those rules. The rules are the rules, my way or the highway. You slid under my roof, you do follow my rules type of attitude. Low discipline, high nurturing, we call permissive. Lots of love, but no rules, no guidelines, lots of flexibility, but the child is not told not to do something. If I just love the child enough, they'll turn out okay. Neglect, there's neither discipline nor nurturing. Basically, the child raises themselves. So how do these four predict what the outcome is of the child as an adult? Oh, well, first, here are some examples. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So the child comes in late, misses the curfew. The authoritative parent will ground you for a week and then recognize, oh, but it's prom night Saturday night, and I know you've really been looking forward to going to prom night. So here's the deal. You're grounded except for prom night, but instead of a week, it's going to be 9 days. They have a conversation, they come up with a strategy. There's a little bit of negotiation, but the teenager still has to follow the rules. Authoritarian, grounded for a week, no exception. Oh, you're going to argue with me about prom? You got 2 weeks of grounding. My rules are the rules. That's it. No negotiation, no sympathy for exceptional situations. Permissive. Oh, you missed curfew. I really wish you wouldn't do that, but, well, I understand these things happen. So there's no consequences, and the child's actually protected from negative consequences. The typical example is the parent who donates money to the police widow and orphan funds so that the kid doesn't get put in jail for drunk driving. Okay, they don't have to accept any consequences to the behavior. And the last one is the neglected child There's no curfew, there's no nothing. The child raises themselves. Very often, these children will find other people to serve as surrogate parents. It may be a favorite teacher, it could be a minister or a rabbi, it could be a gang leader, depending on where you live. So these are examples of the 4 types of parenting styles. And again, I do recognize that lots of people use lots of different mixes of these depending on the circumstances and the living situation. So there are correlations to the parenting style. Authoritative parents tend to produce students or adults who are highly successful and have high self-esteem. They understand about discipline, they understand about consequences, and they feel good about themselves at the same time. Authoritarian, where there's high discipline and low nurturing, these now adult children will be highly successful. They've learned discipline, they understand the consequences, but they have low self-esteem because they don't feel good about themselves. Low discipline and high nurturance tend to have low success and high self-esteem. I'm wonderful. My parents have always told me I'm wonderful. Anything that goes wrong can't be my fault. It's somebody else's fault, always. They tend to not be very successful. I'm sure we all know people who are like that, unfortunately. And then the neglected child grows up usually with low success, low self-esteem. But again, they may have found a surrogate parent who can see them through their childhood and adult and teenage years and avoid this neglecting consequence. So what does this have to do with animal training? Well, as animal trainers, we have the options of having high discipline and high nurturance, low discipline or low nurturance, or combinations of the two. So let's look at these. What I would call a balanced training, you appropriately reward and punish behaviors, but you also recognize when the animal is scared, confused, dominant, or submissive. You can see that the animal's not doing what you want it to do or not learning what you want it to learn, not because it's being stubborn, but because it doesn't understand. So you set specific guidelines and rules, no peeing in the house, but you also recognize that if the animal has a yeast infection or a urinary tract infection, it may pee in the house because it can't help it. High discipline and no nurturance, this would be more of the old style dominance training where the animal has to do what you tell it to do every single time. And if it doesn't, you force the animal to. The animal can't win. You will get an animal that does what you want it to do, but because it's afraid of what happens if it doesn't, not because it understands that doing things right is a good thing. Low discipline, high nurturance, this would be positive training. And if positive training is done incorrectly, it can be done correctly and have good success. But if it's done incorrectly, the animal gets lots of rewards, no appropriate behavior or poor behavior has no consequence. So the animal basically runs over the trainer, trains the trainer to give me treats whenever I demand it. Low discipline, no nurturance is no training. The animal receives no consequences. Its behavior is ignored. And basically you have an animal who does whatever it wants and doesn't understand consequences and how to behave appropriately. So what are some of the consequences of these 4? High nurturing, high discipline, balanced training. You become a highly predictable trainer. The animal understands exactly what is expected and the different consequences for different behaviors and cooperates well without fear. This produces a well-trained animal. High discipline, low nurturance, dominance training. Once again, the human is highly predictable and the animal will cooperate very well, but it's because it's afraid. And if the animal becomes too afraid, it may become defensive aggressive, or it may shut down and stop working for you. Just not cope if things get taken too far. Positive training without discipline, you're not predictable. It never knows what's going to happen. because you reward it for everything under the sun and it's not under control. You have an animal that's going to run off if you accidentally drop the leash or that type of thing, because there's no consequence to doing that. And then low discipline, low nurturance, no training. The human's not predictable and the animal's not under control. So that's why I like to use this analogy when we're talking about these 4 types of training technique. The balanced trainer has a plan. You know when to reward, you know when to punish, and we'll talk about punishment a little later. The discipline dominance trainer is very, very strict and may not recognize when the animal is confused, when the animal is scared. I had a case of a little Chihuahua mix where the father in the family had been told to dominate the dog from a puppyhood. So he would scruff the puppy, he would roll the puppy, he was very rough with the puppy. And he realized that the dog was afraid of him. And he was just heartbroken because he was actually a very nice man who had been given very bad advice. And so the dog would walk around, very hang dog. The man would call him over and the dog would be afraid to come. And the man would yell at the dog and drag him over because he had been told the dog can't win. I came there and I called the dog over and the dog was all hang dog. And just very briefly, he wagged his tail. And I went, oh, you wagged your tail. And I did a happy dog dance where you bounce around like a dog that's happy. And the dog's face completely changed. And he started bouncing around back to me, wagging his tail, jumping up and down. It was like he said, finally, somebody understands what I'm trying to say. And I showed the man how to change what he was doing, and things improved very rapidly. You have probably met dogs who are untrained, or even cats who are untrained. I keep talking about dogs because we don't normally think about training cats, but cats are actually highly trainable. We just don't know it most of the time. So I apologize if you're a cat person or a horse person or a miniature pig person, and I'm only talking about dogs. All of these things hold true for other species as well. Don't forget to ask questions and we'll get to them at the end. So what are positive training techniques? I am not opposed to positive training. It's actually wonderful. And what you are seeing here is a rat who's being tickled. In laboratory environments, when they have to give rats injections, what they have discovered is if they play with the rat first, if they tickle its tummy, if they play little bouncy games with the rat, and then they pick up the rat to give it its injection, the rat is very calm and happy and doesn't mind the injection. If they just grab the rat and shove the injection in, you get a rat who's afraid and they may bite or they may cower. So they're using positive techniques that are species appropriate in all kinds of environments, not just in the home. And we've got a number of different positive training techniques that we can use. We've got the lure technique. I'm going to show you videos of all of these in a moment, so bear with me. We've got modeling. We've got shaping through successive approximation, which we usually shorten to shaping. We've got capturing behavior and social observational learning. While you're teaching your animal what not to do, we also have to teach the animal what to do instead. So if you have a dog that's jumping up to get your attention, you don't want that. Teach it to sit for attention instead. Do substitute a different behavior so it knows what to do right instead of always doing wrong and not being successful. So lure technique is where you use treats to lead to the desired behavior with the treat. And here's an example. I'm going to move this forward a little. I've shut off the sound. What you're going to see is you have your request or your command, your lure is your treat, the response is the behavior, and then you give the animal the reward. Here they're teaching the dog to lay down, and they've got a treat in their hand. The dog was sitting, doesn't know lay down yet, so they're using the treat to get the dog to lay down. That's the lure technique. Now, here's an example of a lure technique with cat. As I said, cats are very trainable. They're going to teach the cat to sit. Oops. Let's move on to this one. There we go. So he taps to get the cat on the chair. He's got food in there, and he's going to move the spoon up over the back of the cat's head so that the cat will naturally sit. You pair this with the command sit, and you do this a number of times again. You'll see it again in just a moment. Here it is again. If you move the treat back over the head, the natural behavior is for the cat to sit. So cats are highly trainable. And then shaping is where you can't get the animal to do the goal behavior or the target behavior. So you have to break the behaviors down into little pieces, step by step. You do successive approximations of the final goal behavior. And here's an example of this. He's calling this shaping from the neck, but it's actually shaping through successive approximations. This dog doesn't know sit, and they want the dog to learn to lay down. So they first reward just dropping the head. Once the dog is doing that, she drops it lower and lower until the head is dropped. And then the dog naturally crouches down. So you start out with little behaviors and then move forward. Capturing is where you wait for the behavior to happen naturally. This has to be a behavior that's in the animal's natural repertoire. So here's an example of teaching lay down. The owner of the video calls this shaping by bridging. That's not actually what bridging is, but it's a great example of capturing the target behavior. So you give the dog something to do. That's the wrong video. Let's see if this is the right video. Yeah, this is the right video. I apologize. They're in the wrong position. So he's calling this the all or none, but it's capture. What he's done is he's got some treats handy. He's going to bring the dog into a room and close the door. And the goal is to teach the dog to sit on command. What he's going to do is wait until the dog gets so bored that it lays down by itself, teaching it to lay down by command, and it gets treated. So you're capturing the goal behavior instead of teaching the goal behavior. It lays down again, it gets told good, and gives them the treat. So then you wait, you give the command just before the dog lays down, you capture the command to the behavior, and then reward the dog. Modeling, whoops, let's go back. No, where's modeling? There it is. Modeling is what he's calling shaping by behavior, by bridging. Modeling is where you forcibly put the dog in position to do the goal behavior. What he's teaching is down, lay down, by forcing the dog under an object or a leg. Now, we're not dragging the dog and shoving the dog. He's actually using treats to get the dog to go under the object. So he's using luring as well, but positioning the dog's body by forcing it into the correct position and then rewarding that behavior. I hope that made sense. Okay. Finally, we have observational learning, and I have two videos for you. The first is a laboratory example of observational learning, where what you're going to see is there's a box with a lever, and when the dog presses the lever, treats fall out the bottom. They trained one dog to press the lever with its nose and then let another dog watch it do that. They trained a different dog to press the lever with its front paw and let another dog watch doing that. And the question was, if you see your companion dog press the lever with its nose, will you use your nose or will you use your paw? So this is about a minute long. This was done by Dory in 2009. It's a published research study. So the baseline we have to have is the two test dogs. They're going to show that the dogs wander around the room and ignore box and the lever. They just move around. They don't even know to pay attention to it. So these are the two test dogs. The next thing you're going to see is a trained dog who's been trained to push the lever with its nose. And the big dog, the big test dog, is watching the trained dog do this. You can't see the big test dog, but it's in the room watching the other dog. So it pressed the lever, and now the test dog is going to be tested. Will it use its nose or will it use its paw? It saw the other dog use its nose, so it uses its nose as well. This dog watched a dog use its paw, and it chose to use its paw to push instead of its nose. So they did show observational learning, which is actually pretty interesting. The next video is what we call training a dog to do what I do. And this dog is already trained to do this. This is pretty advanced. But this dog has been taught whatever my owner does, whatever my handler does, I should copy that behavior. So it learned how to do this already. So this is a demonstration of observational learning. She's not telling the dog to do anything. She's just putting her hands behind her back and saying, do what I do. And the dog is very good at this because it's already trained. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Mary Claire didn't realize, because it wasn't in my bio, but I actually have done research with elephants for a number of years at the Indianapolis Zoo. We studied elephant vision, we studied elephant memory, we studied social behavior. So I feel very comfortable having the elephant in the room. But the elephant in the room when we're talking about positive reinforcement and punishment is always dominance training. If you've had me before, this is going to sound familiar if you've heard some of my talks before. There's a myth about what dominance means when we're talking about animals. The first myth is that animals and dogs have dominance hierarchies, or dogs have dominance hierarchies because wolves have dominance hierarchies. Well, they diverged very early, and dogs generally don't have consistent dominance hierarchies. Wolves do because they're family groups, they're packs and they're family groups. Dogs are not consistent in who's dominant. You may have a more confident personality or a more subordinate, insecure personality, but a lot of times who's in charge will change in the context of the situation. Another false premise is that dogs try to dominate us or cats try to dominate us. All of this holds for cats as well. So the myth is animals will try to dominate us unless we dominate them, and it's always a conflict situation. Most of the time, 99% of the time, that's not true either. And the science studies of dog and cat behavior support that. The other false premise is that the dominant or the alpha animal is always more aggressive, less tolerant, and generally dangerous. Well, a truly in charge animal, whether it's a dog or a human or a cat or a horse or a monkey, everybody knows they're in charge just by the way they carry themselves and by experience. They tend to be less aggressive because they don't have to prove anything. Everybody knows that they're the one who is in charge of the situation. And they can show what we call noblesse oblige. There's one piece of cheesecake, I get first choice, but if I don't want it and I know that you do, you can have it. That's more of an alpha dominant situation than what we think as dominance, these myths that are perpetuated. The scientific definition of dominance is actually having higher priority when resources are limited. I have first choice when there's only one piece of cheesecake. So the myth is dominant animals are aggressive, bigger, and dangerous. The reality is a dominant animal, again, is more relaxed and confident. I don't have to prove that I'm dominant. just the way I carry myself, people are going to listen to me. They're not necessarily dangerous. And again, they can show noblesse oblige. So when we're talking about dominance training, it's based on false information. It's not based on science. It's not social dominance. We don't use the term dominance as social dominance. We use it in terms of if resources are limited, who gets first priority? Resources can be food, they can be shelter, they can be the favorite spot on the couch, they can be access to their human for petting or play. Limited resources are when dominance comes into effect. So when we're talking about dominance training, the myth, the dog can't win. If that dog doesn't listen to you, make it. The fact is, if you make it without analyzing why the dog is not listening to you, you can make it more fearful and make it dangerous because you're terrifying it. Most of the aggression cases I see, most of the bite cases I see, are because the animal is terrified and doesn't know what else to do. Instead, don't make it a conflict. Diffuse the situation, try something else, something less threatening. You have to physically dominate and show the dog who's boss. You got to be physical. Or with cats, people pick up cats by the scruff of the neck. That's incredibly painful. And it just makes the cat scared of you. It's more likely to scratch you and try to bite you if you constantly reach for it and try to dominate it by scruffing. The myth that, well, that's what mama cats do to their babies, actually they don't. They may pick up the baby to carry it, but they're not scruffing it for punishment. Physically dominating a dog, again, can escalate the problem because now you've scared the dog. Now that you've hurt the dog and the dog is afraid. Dominance training can work. It's very fast. It can be very effective. It's based on a false premise of what dominance really represents. It also creates fear aggression. Animals that avoid you or shut down, they just give up. Or it can produce obsessive compulsive behaviors, chronic licking, chronic spinning, barbering, where they pull their own fur out. There's all kinds of things that can happen. And all of this holds for cats and other animals as well. So what do you do if the animal's not cooperating? Well, why is it not cooperating? You have to play a pet detective and analyze what the problem is. Very often the animal is afraid or it's confused. It doesn't know what you want and it doesn't know what to give you. Or neophobia, and you all know neophobia is when the animal is put in a new situation or around strange people or strange objects and is afraid. Or it's not cooperating because while you're treating the animal and telling it to do one thing, your spouse or your partner or your other trainer is doing something different. So when you say sit, the dog doesn't know whether it's your sit or the other person's sit or something completely different. 5% of the time or less. And I have to say, this is not just based on my own experience and opinion. This is based on scientific evidence and the experience of many, many behaviorists and veterinary behaviorists and advanced trainers. Only 5% of the time will you actually find an animal that's got a dominance issue, and very often it's just territoriality. And occasionally you get a dog that's, or an animal of any kind, that's just dumb. Animals have individual personalities, and I knew a yellow lab that was just, forgive me, dumber than a box of rocks. Whereas other dogs would learn to sit in 5 trials, this dog took 40. And he was very sweet and he was very loving and he had an incredibly short attention span and he just did not learn very fast. But dominance training wasn't going to help him. He needed more training, slower steps, smaller steps. So analyze why the animal's not cooperating, and rather than forcing it, fix the issue. But what about punishment? I'm saying don't do dominance training, but what about punishment? Well, there's punishment and then there's punishment. Again, before you decide to punish your animal, analyze why it's doing what it's doing. Why is it acting inappropriately? Is it afraid? Is it confused? Has it been trained something different? Play detective. Use punishment as a last option, and I should add a caveat to that, unless it's a risky situation. I mean, if your dog is about to be hit by a car and you have to jerk it out of the way, that's punishing, but you've saved that dog's life. Use your judgment. Use it as a last option because punishment can create anxiety, fear, and defensiveness. It can make aggression or fear responses worse. But if you have to punish, be quick, use a moderate level, and be consistent. Your predictability is essential. If you only punish when the animal does a particular behavior that is inappropriate, then you're being predictable and it will learn not to do that behavior. You can use negative punishment, remove a consequence that the animal wants to reduce the undesired behavior. You can use a positive punishment. Too strong a punisher will cause defensive aggressive or learned helplessness. But we've already talked about what happens if we don't punish when it's necessary to. So my preferred punishers are startlers. A sudden noise like, eh. The dog will go, oh, what was that? And stop what they're doing. And then you go, oh, good dog. Here, do this instead. A penny can. Take a pop can or a soda can, stick about 15 pennies in it, tape the top closed. And when the animals are doing something that you don't want, shake the can. It makes a big rattling noise. It's very startling. Or you can even just clap your hands really loud. Sometimes I will shout. My dogs have learned to ignore they just get too excited. They're young. They're a year old. They play really rowdy. Sometimes they get too rowdy. So I may have to yell, stop. But it's a startler. And they stop and then they get rewarded for stopping. A sudden timeout is a punisher. If you withdraw your attention, that animal first will try to get that attention back by escalating the behavior you don't want. But then if you continue to ignore that animal, it will stop doing that behavior, and then you can substitute something else for it. So if you have a dog that's jumping on you, for example, we talked about this before, stare at the ceiling, fold your arms, and don't pay any attention. Don't look at the dog. Don't tell the dog no. Don't do anything to interact with that dog until all four are on the floor, all 4 feet are on the floor, and then go, oh, good dog, that's what I want, and pet it. It'll immediately jump up again, ignore it again, and then when it's got 4 on the floor, say, good dog, sit. And when it sits, then it gets its attention. And very quickly, the dog learns jumping gets me the opposite of what I want, and sitting gets me the attention. Some dogs learn this in 5 trials. Some dogs, like that yellow lab, learn it in 40. But it's very effective if you stick to the guns and if you don't let the animal manipulate you into giving it attention. Remove a reward. If an animal's being inappropriate, I follow the rule of my own dogs, abuse it and lose it. If they start to argue over a chew toy, and I have many chew toys down at the same time, there's always at least 5 for the 2 dogs. If they start to argue over one, all of those 5 chew toys go away. They just lose them. And what they learn very quickly is when I do this behavior, this is the consequence. And that's a punisher. I've removed something. I'm using a negative punisher to reduce a behavior. And then the next day they can get them back again. Or the next hour they can get them back again, as long as they don't argue over them. So punishers are appropriate if you pick the right level and the right type of punisher under the right circumstances. So my takeaways for you: use the 4 quadrants, but know what they are and use them appropriately. Positive reinforcer, negative reinforcer, positive punisher, negative punisher. Don't expect your animal, whether it's a horse, a dog, a cat, a bird, you name it, don't expect instant understanding. You have to make sure the animal has learned what it is you want it to do or what it is you want it not to do in a way that it actually understands. This may mean using shaping. This may mean using luring or modeling or timeouts. Figure out what's going to work best for your animal. You got an animal that's dumber than a box of rocks? Shaping and luring works really well. You have an animal that learns really fast and is smart as a whip, sharp as a whip, modeling and observation learning may work. Now, observational learning takes some work. It's not something that animals automatically do, but they can do it. Punishment is acceptable if it's done correctly. I've already talked about this. The timeout, the standing timeout, the startling noise, the negative punishment. Please don't use pain. Pain makes things worse. If you are using a pinch collar, it works because it hurts. Put it on your arm and jerk it and see what happens. If you need something to control the animal's head or because the animal is pulling too hard, teach it to wear a head halter instead. There are halties, there are snoot loops. Whoops, here's one dog. There are gentle leaders. There are even walking harnesses. Excuse me, speaking of dog inappropriate behavior. Sorry about that. And then, so avoid pain. And then the next thing is if you have a serious behavior problem or concern with one of your animals, please seek professional help. It may mean calling your veterinarian and asking for a recommendation. It may mean calling an obedience trainer. It may mean calling someone like myself, a certified behaviorist. I'm actually laughing inside because you got to see my own dogs do inappropriate behavior. And what I did was I didn't yell at them. I just pushed them back off the chair, which they know means this is not the time to be with mom. But I'm laughing at myself because here I am giving a lecture on this and you got to see my own dogs in action. So seek professional help early, don't wait. If you wait, very often these problems just get worse, and very often real behavior problems don't respond to just simple obedience training. It takes more, there are things we need to do. So don't hesitate. At worst, at best, it just takes a phone call and a recommendation. At worst, you may need to set up a visit and do some work over several weeks or months to get the problem resolved.